This is a wedged through mortise and tenon sprung breadboard end. And that sounds like a mouthful, but it does actually make sense. So if after this video you still have any questions on this particular joint, then be sure to check the link in the description below and I'll explain it in further detail. It's been just under 2 years since my wife and I had an actual dining table, so I think it's time to make a dining table. This is 61¼ board feet of 4/4 hickory, and I also have a 3-inch thick slab of hickory that's been drying for quite some time, so it's ready to use. And this should be enough for me to make the dining table. I don't know if I have enough to make the benches that will be made to match. I'm not making any chairs for this. It's just going to be 2 benches, one on either side. That's just what me and my wife want. So no chairs for this build. And the dining table itself is going to be a little bit on the mission style design, and I'm not exactly sure on all of the fine details, so I'll work that out as I go. But for right now, I want to get started on making the dining table top. The boards that I picked out for the tabletop are the flattest and straightest boards that I've got, and they're, like I said, pretty darn flat to begin with, so I'm not going to use the jointer on the wide surfaces. Instead, I'm just going to skip plane them to try and maximize the thickness of the top through the milling process. Now, once these are done being skip planed, I will have to joint the edges before gluing them up. This top is eventually going to have breadboard ends, but before I can get to that stage, I do need to glue up the entire panel. So I've oriented the boards the way that I think looks the best, and each one of the boards has a slight tilting section of sapwood, this lighter sapwood color. So I've oriented the boards so that the sapwood kind of starts in the middle and goes to the outside on each one of these boards. Kind of starts in the middle and then goes to the outside there. So it kind of has this nice flowing vein through the tabletop. And I really like that. So to make sure that these stay in the exact orientation that they're in, and also to make sure that the tops remain level as I glue them together, I'm going to use floating tenons in the same way that biscuits would be used. If you have a biscuit joiner, this is the perfect opportunity to use one. I don't, so I'm going to use floating tenons in the same way that biscuits would be used.
3, 2, 1, go!
I let the panel sit in the clamps overnight, and I'm very pleased with the way that this has turned out. It looks really, really good. I'm not going to worry about all of the pencil lines or the small little glue spots here and there until the breadboard ends, or until the entire top is completely done. Then I'll scrape the top and clean it up. But before I can do the breadboard ends, I need to square off each one of the ends, and to do that easily, I'm going to use my circular saw and homemade track. If you're not familiar with one of these circular saw jigs, the concept is extremely simple. There's dozens of videos on YouTube how to make one of these. Basically, the base of your circular saw rides up against this larger section of the track over here, and that guides it perfectly straight. This base side over here is where the blade ends up being, so you line this side up with your reference line that you already have where you want to make your cut, clamp it in place, and then you can use your circular saw to make very accurate, straight, perfect cuts exactly where you want them. The only downside of using a circular saw is the vast majority of them have no convenient way to make great dust collections, so they throw dust everywhere. That's my biggest complaint with using this method. There's several different ways to make breadboard ends. I'm going to do something a little bit different and make a through mortise and tenon joint in the middle, and then have a hidden tongue and groove joint for the rest of it. So if I know that this is a through mortise and tenon joint in the middle, then I know all of the joinery needs to start at the same distance away from the edge as the width of the material that I'm using for the breadboard end. So right off the bat, I can strike a line where my joinery will start. Now I want this tongue and groove joint to be hidden, so I've come in 1/2 inch from either side, and that's where the tongue will actually start, and it will come all the way into the center 4 inches of the panel. Because this is a symmetrical panel, there's 2 boards on either side, everything is the same size. That means that this seam right here is the exact center line, and that's very convenient because I can come 2 inches from either side, and that is my through tenon. Once I have all my dimensions laid out, I can transfer it to the end of my breadboard piece, and I'll cut the mortise first, the mortise section on the breadboard end first, rather than the tenon. And the cool thing about having all of this waste area right up here is all of this is just going to be cut off anyway, so I can use this with my router to make a couple test plunges to really dial in the router height to make sure that this fits the mortise really well before I even get to the actual piece of material that will make up the joint. I'm using a plunge router and an edge guide attachment to make both the grooves and mortises on both of the breadboard ends. And to give the router a little bit more stability and more surface area to reference off of, I've mounted both of the breadboard ends back to back in my workbench vise, and this just prevents it from tipping a little bit more as I'm making the cuts. Now, to make sure that the groove is perfectly centered, I will make all of the cuts from one side and then flip the boards end for end, referencing off of the other wide face, and then repeat the cuts, and this will essentially just make the groove perfectly centered. Now, the same thing needs to happen for the mortise that's going to be through cut in the middle, and that needs to be cut from both sides of the material because I can't make the full depth plunge from one side. Now, the completed mortises at this step should be a little bit small in the width direction, and that's because I'm going to fine tune it with a chisel once I get the tenon sized to its final dimension. This is the side of my tabletop with the end facing this breadboard end, and I've clamped it in place so that I can use a marking knife to transfer the exact measurement of the width of my groove to the tabletop itself, and I can use these marks to really dial in my router so that I remove the appropriate material both top and bottom, and that will leave me with a good sized tongue to fit into this groove absolutely perfectly. Once I have everything dialed in, I can go ahead and make all of my joinery cuts, both the long tongue and the 4-inch tenon in the middle of the piece. Now that I have the router depth dialed in, I'm using a marking knife and a straight edge to make a deep scoring cut where the eventual intersection of the breadboard end and the panel will be. This will prevent any tear out from the router. I used the router to remove the material from both the top and bottom direction only in the areas where the tongue and tenon will be. I left the rest of the material to act as a little bit more support for the router base. Now I can use a handsaw to establish the width of the tenon, and then probably just a jigsaw to remove the bulk of the rest of the waste next to all of the tongues. After that, I do need to clip off 1/2 of an inch on either side of the tongue, and that is so that this entire joint will be concealed from the left and right sides. I went ahead and squared up the rounded corners for the through mortise on the breadboard ends, and that's just for a test fit. I'll have to redo this process a little bit later once I get to the wedges, or to allow room for the wedges. But for right now, I'm working on getting this whole breadboard end test fit onto the ends, and the through mortise and tenon is fitting just fine, but my tenon here, the tongue and groove joint, is a little bit thick, so I'm going to use a router plane to bring it down just a little bit. And this is actually the first time I've been able to use this router plane. It was a gift from a good friend of mine, Nick Ferry, and man, what a treat it is to use it in this particular situation. I don't have a shoulder plane, which would also do the job, but this router plane is perfect for this situation right here. And if my adjustments were accurate, this test fit should go on there nice and easy. The test fit is very nice. I'm quite pleased with the way that this turned out. So now I can focus my attention on the wedged through mortise and tenon, starting with tapering the inside mortise. Tapering the inside faces of the mortise is really easy. Just strike a line about 1/8 of an inch to the outside of the existing mortise, and then extend the long faces of the mortise with a wider chisel, and then just chop away the inside at a slight angle, resulting in an angled face of the end grain portion of the mortise. I cut 2 relief holes near the base of the tenon where the tenon meets the tongue and groove part of the joint, and now all I have to do is make a saw kerf connecting the relief hole to the outside of the tenon, about 3/16 of an inch or so away from the end of this tenon. And what this saw kerf allows me to do is drive a wedge all the way down, and as it's properly seated, it'll push this angled part of the tenon, or this small part of the tenon, out to conform to the outside face of the mortise, the angled face of the mortise I just cut. And what that essentially does is turns this square tenon into a dovetail. And once that dovetail is expanded, there's no way for it to back out of the mortise. It's just locked permanently in place. For a little bit of a contrast, I'm using walnut for the wedges, and I'm sizing it to the appropriate thickness at the workbench with a hand plane, and then I'll cut an appropriate size or shape out at the bandsaw, and then fine tune that angle just a little bit with the hand plane and kind of clean up all the bandsaw marks. The whole point of breadboard ends are to keep the panel that they are connecting to nice and flat long term, and you can only glue or firmly secure the center section, which is what I'm doing with this mortise and tenon joint, and the rest of it has to be floating. That's because that the grain is going in different directions from the panel and the breadboard end. The whole panel itself needs to expand and contract and needs to have room for that. So for that reason, that's why this tongue and groove joint on the outsides is not glued. It's going to be floating. But I don't want this piece over time to bow out on either one of the sides. I want a nice firm connection long term. So to do that, I'm making this a sprung joint. So instead of this being perfectly flat, it's going to have a slight hollow in the middle, and that means that the outside points will contact first. Once they are in contact, then I can clamp the interior section in even tighter, which will bend this in the opposite direction just slightly, not much at all. And then at that point, I can lock it in place with the glue and wedges. This will make sure that this stays nice and tight long term, and it still allows expansion room for the panel itself. I was going to make the sprung portion of this with a hand plane by taking a couple passes, but lo and behold, I put a straight edge on these, and there already is a very, very slight hollow in the middle, so I don't even have to do that. But if you wanted to do this, it's just a couple passes with a hand plane, starting from the center with a short pass and working your way out 3 or 4 times just to remove a little bit of material in the middle and not so much on the ends. Now I'm only gluing the mortise and tenon section of the joint and also the wedges that will be glued into place. I'll use my workbench vise to pull this joint closed, or push it I should say. After the glue has had proper time to dry, I can clean up the breadboard ends and then also shave the through tenon nice and flush. So I flushed up all of the joints and used a cabinet scraper to remove some of the imperfections on the top and also my pencil lines. I still need to do a final finish prep on this tabletop, but I'll save that for when I do the final finish prep on the entire table. Now I know that these joints where the breadboard ends stop on their end grain, I know these are not going to be perfectly flush over time because the panel will shrink and expand with humidity changes. So this will change going forward, but that's fine. Now, the through mortise and tenon joints, the wedged through mortise and tenon joints, one of them turned out absolutely perfect. I'm very pleased with it. The second one, I had a mental screw up and it's not 100% perfect. As I was driving the second wedge in place, I realized that I did not grab the wedge, but instead I grabbed the offcut from when I made the wedge, so it wasn't long enough. was a dumb mistake on my part, and I didn't realize it until I got it all the way seated that, hey, this isn't long enough, and there's no way for me to pull it back out. So mental error on my part. I kind of panicked for a second and then cut a little bit of end grain, or cut a little slice of hickory and just put it on the outside of the wedge where it didn't fully seat into the mortise. Structurally, it's perfectly okay. However, visually, there's like a 1/16 of an inch more on one side than the other. You really have to get about a foot or so close to it to actually see it. But it was a mental error, and I panicked, but I still got the joint completed. So you live and learn. I won't do that again. Anyway, if you want to see the rest of this table, I still need to do the table base, and it's going to be somewhat of a mission style. So go ahead and subscribe if you are interested in seeing it. That will be out, I think, next week. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. You guys take care and have a great day.